Welcome to Leading People with me, Gerry Murray. This is the podcast for leaders and HR decision makers who want to bring out the best in themselves and others. Every other week, I sit down with leading authors, researchers, and practitioners for deep dive conversations about the strategies, insights, and tools that drive personal and organizational success. And in between, I bring you one simple thing, short episodes that deliver practical insights and tips for immediate use. Whether you're here for useful tools or thought-provoking ideas, Leading People is your guide to better leadership. My guest this week is Dr. Marcia Reynolds, executive coach, educator, and author of Coach the Person, Not the Problem. In our conversation, we explore what it really means to coach another human being in a deeper way, how co-regulation works, why reflective inquiry matters, what AI can and cannot replace, and how great coaches create the kind of space where people can think more clearly, feel more honestly, and see themselves differently. If you lead people, coach others, or simply want better conversations, there's a lot in this one. Dr. Marcia Reynolds, welcome to Leading People.
Thank you, Gerry. I'm glad to be here.
So, you're coming in from which part of the world today?
I'm actually in lovely Phoenix, Arizona. And
very good.
Weather's great.
Nice part of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've passed down through a lot of that, that Midwest, Northwest, and down to coming down all the way from Idaho down to California area and that. And so it's a fantastic, great way to discover America, I have to say. So before we talk about the new edition of your book, please share with my listeners the journey that led you to where you are today. And were there any like epiphany moments along the way that you'd like to share that led you to this world of coaching?
Yeah, sure. Well, a lot of people, they see me out in the world or all over online. And what they don't recognize is that I'm really a research nerd. I love research. And the reason I do was because I was actually dumped into a training department early in my first job. I actually was hired just to move around TV sets and film projectors, and my boss decided she wanted to get her doctorate, and she dumped the whole training department in my lap, and my first assignment was management training. So I tried to figure out what to do and did pretty well following the manual, but I wanted to do it better. So I went and I got a second master's degree in adult learning, and that's when I was hooked. I'm like, oh, so how do people really learn and grow? And so I would apply what I learned, and it seemed to make it better, but it didn't necessarily change people's behavior over time. They would just try things and, go back to old behavior after a while. So I spent years, and then I went on to another company and a big global tech company and running, all the training. And I'd get better, but it didn't seem to last. So it was actually the last day of my last job that somebody sent me this article about this thing called coaching. It was 1995. Wow. And I said, I'm lucky, good timing. And I said, something's different here. And I watched a demo and I said, I need to understand this. So I signed up for a coaching school and, started coaching and recognizing that, teaching is telling people what to do. But here I was just sharing what I heard them say and asking questions. And it was so much more powerful. And the changes they were making were sustainable. It led me actually to get my doctorate in neural leadership and learning and what really goes on in the brain differently when we coach than when we tell. So that just led me on this whole path that not only do I teach coaching all over the world, but I keep writing books about it because I keep learning more and wanting to share. And there's still even so much more that we can learn about the brain. So I'm not sure when I'll stop, although people are always asking me, when are you going to retire? I don't know. As long as there's more things to learn and share, I'll probably keep going because it's just fascinating to me.
Great. So the book is called Coach the Person, Not the Problem. So, and it's an update. So what inspired the update and who is it for and why now?
Yeah. Well, actually, the original request came from my publisher because the first edition of Coach the Person, Not the Problem is now in 9 languages, sold 100,000 copies. And coaches and leaders, a lot of leaders, HR people, and I get notes every day saying, wow, this made such a difference to me. And it was at the end of last year, my editor, who should have known better, he said, we were looking at our bestsellers and just wanting to know who should do a new edition, and yours popped up. And I'm like, you were surprised? You're my editor. You're not supposed to be surprised. So, and I thought about it. What else do I have to say? And then I realized, all the things, the fear around AI replacing us, and what do we need to do to really utilize our human connection, and all the things I've been learning that to really refine coaching skills. So they said I only needed to change 20%. I've changed at least, or added, a third of the book is new, and I went through every page and updated every page because there's so much that we're learning about learning that I wanted to get out there. And I'm so pleased that all of these coaches I'm interacting with are like, they can't wait for the second edition. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I worked hard to make it work. And honestly, it's for all conversations that you really want to be with someone, help them learn, grow, change their mind. That telling people to do something, be something different doesn't work. So whether you're a leader or even a parent of a teenager, that using a coaching approach and really helping someone think through their dilemmas is so much better than trying to tell them what you think they should do. So I've had, many people in many different areas of life pick up the book.
And if I'm not mistaken, from what I've read over the last couple of years, coaching is one of the fastest growing professions in the world, I believe. And not just for people who want to learn how to be coaches, but more and more we're talking about the coach approach in just day-to-day conversations at work for leaders and managers to understand the principles of coaching. And as you say, it's interesting how maybe somebody comes to the coaching conversation thinking I need to sort out a work problem, and then they sort out something else in their life that's been simmering for. I was giving a training for a couple of days in Brussels this week, and around just day-to-day negotiation stuff. So there was a little bit of neuroscience and stuff in there. But at least 2 or 3 people in the room said, I'm not sure yet how I'm going to apply this at work, but I certainly have a teenage son or daughter, and I think I'm going to get some benefit from it. And one lady had come in and said she'd been on one of these courses earlier, and like her relationship with her 17-year-old son had improved dramatically or something like that. So it's really, really powerful stuff, because it's the principles behind coaching that we want to get at really in understanding it. So anybody out there who's a coach who's listening, this is a great opportunity to upgrade and enhance your understanding and skills. And anybody out there who's been struggling or trying to work out what this coach approach could be in the workplace, I guess we're going to get there as well. So why do we all need someone who is well trained in coaching if we desire personal growth?
Well, we have this thing called our brain, and our brain is primary function is to keep us safe. It's not to make us smart or funny. That may come later, but it's always going, will this hurt me? Will this hurt me? And it doesn't like to feel uncomfortable. So when we try to sort things out on our own, if it's a surface level and no emotions are attached, fine. And AI can help us with that. But if there's something else getting in the way, that we have to go deeper into our belief systems and even how we define ourselves, the brain says, no, not going to let you do that. And the metaphor I use is, have you ever tried to tickle yourself? You can't. The brain says, I know what you're doing, but you go up to somebody else and you just go like that, and they start laughing, and so it's the same thing. The brain, resists self-exploration at anything below the surface. And it requires someone outside of us, and this actually came out of the early years of looking at emotional intelligence and neuroscience in the late 1990s, where they started to write and say, we don't have free will on our own. We need an external disruptor to make us stop and think about our thinking in a way we can't do for ourselves. So coaches, or if you're using a coaching approach, you're an external thought disruptor, to where people can stop and they can look at their thoughts as if you laid them out on a table in front of them, and they can see more objectively how they're thinking, and it shows the gaps in their logic, or when they contradict themselves, or when they say, I want this, and the fear comes with but, and they state that, or the word that often comes up, should. Who's saying should? People are making decisions based on what other people tell them to do. They don't see that until you bring their thoughts out. So it doesn't require that I really know how to ask the powerful question. That often it's just the reflection, the summarizing. So I hear you're saying this and this, that they go, oh, really? I said that? Oh, that doesn't make sense. That I always say breakthroughs don't have to be amazing insights. Sometimes it's just like, duh, I should know that. But they can't do that alone. So that's why coaching has taken off, and using a coaching approach, because it helps people to examine and change their thinking in a way they can't do by themselves, or they won't do when somebody just tells them to think differently.
So I'm hearing a lot around. So the brain, primary purpose in keeping us safe and alive. It's also got a tendency for taking shortcuts and being very efficient, which is why we have lots of bias and lots of other things that help us process the world. It just doesn't like us. We're not willing to challenge those things ourselves. In some way, it makes sense, doesn't it? Like, why would you want to challenge those aspects of your efficiency, operating system, etc.? And as you say, when you play back what somebody just said and ask them to make meaning out of it, because they haven't consciously thought about it, and all of a sudden now they do.
Yeah,
it makes a big difference to their understanding of what's happening in their world.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier before we had this conversation about the identity, and that. No way am I going to question who I think I am, because that's way uncomfortable to not be sure of who I think I am. When I wake up in the morning and before I even get out of bed, I have an idea of who I am that allows me to go about my day. So that just saying, well, it sounds as if you're identifying yourself as, the new person in the job, which makes you less confident, or the outsider, the words they use to define themselves often get in the way of who it is they want to become at their best.
Okay, so we're gonna go a little bit deeper in that as our conversation evolves. One thing that I would just like to touch on now, we'll come back into it, and you've mentioned it already very briefly there earlier on, because it's something that is become very prevalent in our profession, but in everybody's life. And this is the world of AI. And out there, the development of apps and that. The question that comes to mind is, because I'm starting to have these conversations with other coaches, because I've seen some of the apps, And on a lot of transactional type stuff, they seem to do quite well because they can dig deep into the toolbox and react. But what, in your opinion, what aspect of coaching can't be replicated by AI? If this conversation resonates and you're reflecting on your own leadership capacity, you might find our Team Leader Essentials and Performance Accelerator programs very helpful. Both are designed to help leaders strengthen the inner skills that drive outer performance, especially in uncertain and fast-moving environments. You'll find more details at widecircle.eu. That's WIDECIRCLE.eu. Check out the link in the show notes.
In fact,
please reassure all the coaches out there, Marcia. This is your chance to reassure the profession.
The introduction to my book, to the second edition, was all written new to address that issue. That absolutely surface level problem solving AI can do. In entry level coaching probably will go away. And that's why coaches have to keep developing. But when you start to get into really getting beneath the surface and the willingness to challenge, AI always starts with, well, that's a really good situation you're facing, and I honor you for facing that. And, they do a confirming thing. So the willingness to challenge, but to create the emotional energy where your clients will accept your challenge, that's a human factor. So, if there's any emotions attached to the dilemma, then there's other things that are going on that are beneath the surface. As you said, a belief, a bias that they're dearly holding on to because they've, it's defined them, and it's uncomfortable to let it go. We have to create that, not just safety with our energy, but also our emotions will impact their willingness to go deep with us. So when I bring my compassion, my care, my courage, my open curiosity, my emotions, since I'm the coach, my emotions then actually regulate your emotional state. And you will start to feel that care, that courage that I'm actually giving you in our relationship, and we have this emotional energy interaction throughout the whole conversation. And so I also have to, as a coach, be very skilled at maintaining that. Even if you say something that slightly throws me off, that I quickly come back to my courageous, compassionate presence that encourages you to go into those deeper, darker areas that AI can't take you there. And you definitely won't go there on your own. So, and it's not therapy. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going way into your past and trauma, but it's, again, those things that are defining who I am and how the world should be, the world according to me. That when we, in coaching, we start to break down those frames so you can see them and make a choice about them. But it's the energy, that the platform, the connection that I create with you, that you would be even willing to go there with me. That I don't think, and certainly in my lifetime, no matter how sentient they can make AI, I don't see that being replicated.
Okay, so you mentioned, Marcia, entry-level coaching, and I'm going to interpret that as the sort of first level of the basic coaching skills. Am I correct in interpreting that way?
Yeah,
when you say entry-level coaching, because I have a question about this, which an interesting conversation I've been having with various people this last few months has been in response to this constant media, let's say, coverage, which says entry-level jobs are most at threat. And I'm just wondering, there's a sort of paradox or something in there where how are we going to get to the advanced stage if we cannot pass through the, maybe I'm missing something, maybe I'm getting old and I'm missing things. And as you talked about entry level coaching, what will coaches need to do to, because what I'm hearing is that AI can do the entry level stuff as well as a human being can. So how can coaches out there, or anybody who wants to use coaching approach in their day to day, how do they get beyond that entry level and add the value that the AI cannot add?
Well, honestly, with coaching, even at the entry level, when we're talking to somebody who may be anxious about stepping into a new role, what impact they'll have, or they have a difficult conversation coming up, that sometimes they just need a really safe space that they know is confidential and it feels comfortable to talk. And so even new coaches can provide that in a way, again, that AI may not be able to. But I always say there's two transformations that coaches must make. And the first one is just learning the coaching skills, because most of us come out of professions where we're telling people what to do, and giving advice. And to even let go of that, of who I am as the one who knows, in order to just be curious and open and really listening into and receiving what your client's giving you, that's a big transformation. So the basic skills of coaching are important that I embed, and it will change all your conversations. So even if you're not using it as a profession, it'll make you more effective in every conversation, to be more curious, not to always jump in and say what you think, so that we can use the basic skills for many things that require connection with people. But then the next transformation, once they get that down, then it's to say, I know it and I need to let it go. So then I'm just fully present with you and trust that I know enough that I will be listening. What is it that makes you think this is a challenge? What's stopping you from resolving it? What would you like to create that you don't have now? I know I'm doing that by being curious and getting clarity with my clients about how they see things and what they want. And then we move to resolving what's getting in the way, to where they get to a point that they know what to do next. I know that. I don't have to think about it. And that's when we can really maintain the presence and the co-regulation of energies that take people even deeper. So it's not that coaches, I mean, you have to get through the initial stages, the basics, in order to move on. You can't skip that. And people that just call themselves a coach, even though they've never been trained, they're not really coaching. They're just giving advice, And so that's a critical piece. And I still think there's pieces in there, depending on what your client needs, that is still based in the safe, curious space we create that even initial coaches can do. So, when you say entry level positions, but people still have to learn the entry level skills to go into the advanced skills, but they have to stay with it and value education and learning maybe a little bit more than they do now.
That's useful. I think helping people maybe reframe a little bit this, let's call it this emerging new world that we are, that's developing around us at the moment. Now, you talk about two things in the book. You talk about, you actually just mentioned one of them, but you talk about reflective inquiry and you talk about co-regulation. So do you want to continue with the co-regulation so people understand better what you mean by co-regulation? Because you also said there a minute ago something that the coach can see. And you see, AI cannot see you. It can interpret the voice and the words that you're telling, and it cannot see the other person. And there's so much great information in just calibrating somebody's state of being and noticing whether it's changing or altering over a period of time in the coaching conversation. Isn't that right?
Yeah. I mean, even, when we started coaching, it was all on the telephone. But even that, the emotions I brought to the conversation, and to pick up the nuances in the changes in your voice, and really try to understand what's triggering that, or where are you going. That, it's often called attunement, that I'm tuning in to you. I'm able to tune into you. But co-regulation goes beyond just attunement. That, if I can pick up what you're giving me, even beyond the words. But when I say co-regulate, it means that I'm using my emotional state to regulate your emotions. And the reason I can do that is that even though I'm your coach, and I call myself your thinking partner, so you're going to figure things out through my facilitation. But um, I'm still the socially dominant person in our conversation. So when the brain says, "Okay, here's the coach," so there's always a little bit of a power differential. I'm the coach, so I'm the one that gets paid to be here, or is supposed to be making sure something happens. So because the brain still sees me as the dominant person in the conversation, my emotions will impact your emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So you're sensing, by protection, you're sensing what I'm feeling. So if I show some anxiety as the coach, you're going to feel it, and then you will have some anxiety, or even defensiveness. But if I'm sitting here in curiosity and care and courage, and I maintain that throughout, then what you're picking up is that emotional state, which triggers you to feel the same things. So you actually are the one who's co-regulating to my emotions. And that creates that energy between us, this constant energy exchange, because it goes on throughout the conversation. We don't just set it up front. It's a constant energy exchange. So the better I am at coaching to maintain that state, no matter how you react, and maybe even yell at me, which has happened, that it's like, it's okay. I'm here with you, and you're going through an experience, and I believe in you, and I trust the coaching process, that you're going to come up with some insight that's going to make the difference for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I maintain that throughout, and that's a critical piece. Again, AI cannot do. So yeah, they can't go beyond just what they hear, what's being spoken, honestly, and maybe pick up some changes in tone, and pausing. um, but to really get into what's causing that person to stop and think, and to be curious about what's coming up for them, and putting things together that they've spoken, that one thing they said they really wanted, but the other one seems to not have as much passion behind it. We can pick up those little shifts, or big shifts, as well as them then desiring to even hear what we have to say, because of the emotions that I give them to use in this process.
Hmm. So a thought that might be going through some coaches' heads out there, curiosity
Mm-hmm.
thought, would be, how much
Mm-hmm.
responsibility does the coach have for their client's state?
Um, well, actually, because of the way the conversation set up, quite a bit of responsibility. So, I may not direct where the conversation is going to go, but I am responsible for maintaining that we're moving forward, and the emotions that are felt. So, however, it doesn't stop me from sharing something that I know, when I say it, that's going to be a little uncomfortable for them. And that's okay, because I've created a safe space with us, that no matter how they respond, and they may get angry, they may get, really frustrated. I know that emotions don't last. There's an intensity, a reaction and intensity, and then it diminishes. So if I just keep
Hmm.
holding the space and wait and sense when the emotion starts to diminish, then I can come back in and say, would you be willing to share with me what just happened there? What just came to mind? And because I've maintained that safe space, they are willing. I very rarely, and the only times they've said no was because I need to sit with it for a while first before I can even speak it. So, like, no, I'm not telling you. That doesn't happen.
Hmm.
So, there's just so much in terms of the transformation process that is dependent on the emotions that we use. So, yes, I'm responsible for maintaining that emotional state and allowing you to, as my client, to dip in and out of it as you go through the learning about how you think and who you are.
Mm. And you referred to energy earlier when you were describing the state and the interaction. And one of the things I've often explored with people is when we talk about rapport, and there's always these classic things, matching, mirroring, all this. But actually, when you're truly in rapport, you're sharing an energy field that's comfortable for both parties. And so I guess if you're sharing that energy field, you can take somebody else to an emotional place where they need to go perhaps to get the insight, and at the same time bring them back to where they can then land comfortably after that exploration. Is that your experience, Marcia?
Well, absolutely. Actually, before I even wrote the first Coach the Person Not the Problem, I wrote a book called The Discomfort Zone that really looked at the necessity of discomfort in the learning, particularly of self process, that letting go of who I think I am before I can even become my best self, there's a fog of uncertainty that's not comfortable. So yes, I'm holding that energy, I'm holding that space for you to allow that exploration and transformation that doesn't necessarily feel good. So I always say, I'm not here to make you feel better as a coach. I'm here to help you to see better. So I know that this whole conversation you're going to have some ups and downs in your emotions as you start to recognize things. And that's okay, because if I hold that energy field, and I love that you use the word field, because it really is that field. If I hold that, then it's almost like I'm a safety net that that's there, and that you'll go through this process. And even if I've had some people say, I need to think about this, and we come to the end of the session where at least I say, so what does that look like? So I get a commitment that they're going to think about it. They still come back in a day or two then and say, okay, I got it. Or just recently, it was like we ended the conversation. I was with the client live, and as we were walking down the hallway, he's like, okay, I get it now. He just needed a little time to like tick tock. So yeah.
So you've taught thousands of coaches around the world, and how long and how challenging is it for coaches to develop the skill set you've just described around holding that space and the energy, understanding the energy in that space, and then having knowing where those emotional boundaries might be in terms of guiding the client? How long or how challenging is that for coaches?
I think the better word is how challenging. How long is, of course, going to differ. And it differs not just by person, but by culture. Because it is the process of, okay, I have to learn the skills and get really good at them. But so many people grow up in cultures, and not just by country, but by family culture, where I have to get the A on the test. I have to do everything right, and I'm saying, okay, you have to learn the skills to do that, but then you have to forget about it and not worry about it and get out of your head and don't think. And they've been rewarded all their life for thinking. To quit thinking is a difficult process. So it really depends on how willing are you to trust that you know enough to make a difference with the client without thinking. And some people can pick that up, fairly well. People who know flow, like creative people, actually. But the people, especially that came up through technical fields or academics, and letting go of that. And I know that. I mean, I grew up in a household that if I didn't get an A, something was wrong. So I always say I do a lot of work in Asia, where it's really pushed the academic success, and they're always saying, "Oh, Marcia, you don't understand," especially in China, where I've been teaching for 15 years. And I said, I do understand. Jewish mothers are just like Chinese mothers. So I've had a similar experience.
Right.
Yeah.
And now I mentioned it earlier, and I kind of feel it might be an appropriate time to, now that we're you're talking about the challenge of embracing these skills and getting maybe out of that A grade mindset that people have grown up with. You talk about reflective inquiry, and what is it, and why is it an important conversation process for both coaches, the coachees, and even for leaders to use? You're listening to Leading People with me, Gerry Murray. My guest this week is Dr. Marcia Reynolds, executive coach and author of Coach the Person, Not the Problem. Coming up, why reflective inquiry matters so much, how great coaches help people see themselves differently, and what it really means to coach the person instead of just trying to fix the issue in front of them.
Well, I think in the early years, and even within my own coach training, the focus was on asking questions. And I remember arguing with a well-known coach who said, really, he was trying to make the transition from consulting to coaching because he really was, we mucked up coaching and consulting. And he said, nobody really wants you to sit there and ask them questions for an hour. And I said, I agree. That's not what coaching is. And that more and more as I started to understand what we're doing, being their thinking partner, that the use of reflecting what they're saying and experiencing with the emotional shifts is even far more powerful than the follow-up question. The better I get at catching their key words and concepts and summarizing it concisely back to them, that sometimes it's just a word that I use that they said, that they realize they said it only after I shared it, that they're like, oh, right. Yeah, that's the problem. So reflective inquiry means it's reflective statements plus questions that make the difference. Yeah, and so the people often, again, that still say, well, I don't have time and I don't know what questions to ask. It's not about questions. Just be with them and share what you hear them saying. Just try that. Because even that helps people feel, wow, you're really listening to me, and you're trying to understand me. And for a leader to do that, to stop in the hallway and just look at them and say, okay, here's what I hear you saying. Is that correct? What a difference that makes to the conversation instead of just jumping in and saying, well, you should go try this without really listening to them.
And this seems to unlock a little bit the title of the book, because as you were explaining that, you said when you give that person the chance to reflect, they sometimes say, that's the problem. And so people out there listening to this might be wondering, what does Marcia mean by coach the person and not the problem? And you do talk about identity as a way to create sustainable change in behavior, because a lot of coaches will come from a school that says it's all about behavior change. And I think you have something a bit deeper to talk about here. So what is that distinction you're trying to get across here that says coach the person, not the problem? What is that sort of mistake that tends to be made in focusing maybe too much on the problem?
That's exactly it right there. The focus on the problem. That if we're just finding I worked in the tech world for years, and we used to say you can't solve a surface level problem. You have to do a deep cause analysis, So you're smiling. You probably heard that,
Well, there's the whole concept of adaptive capacity and adaptive problems trying to be solved with simple solutions and all sorts of stuff like that. So
Exactly.
that's what I'm smiling about.
Right. And so I'm saying now we're talking about behavior, that it's like a root cause analysis, that I'm just really needing to dig a little deep of what belief is causing you to do that. And also the belief of who you think you are that's driving you to do that, that bringing that to the surface, where they really discover their key motivators for their behavior. Um, and you just can't tell them that because they'll resist it. They need to discover it on their own. And that is also defining who they think they are. Bringing it to the surface allows them to look at it and to determine if that's what it is that needs to change. And so I'm also giving them agency to say, yeah, that's right. That's really stopping me. That's really getting in the way. That's why I'm not doing this, or I'm doing it wrong. So I'm not saying the problem, we don't think about the problem. It's coaching the person's thinking in the context of their problem. So it's not just to externally look at what have you tried, what's worked, what doesn't work, what are the threats, the risks, the rewards. Okay, that's external, and that's just basic problem solving. But to go into what is it that you see that you think is this is a challenge, and I want to see what you see. So I want to ask you questions about what do you mean by that, what has occurred that you think that's making you think this is wrong, and then what's making this a challenge for you that you can't resolve on your own. I need to understand that, because as I understand that, you come to understand it even better. So my attempts to clarify and see what you see helps you to clarify it for yourself as well. And so it's that whole process of looking at your thinking pattern and sharing it, looking underneath what's tied to that pattern, helps you see your own possibilities. What is it that you discovered that, okay, this is what I need, what needs to happen in order for me to solve that problem. So all I am is a thinking partner. I'm not going to tell you what to do, because if I do, then if it goes bad, you'll blame me. I'm just there to help you think in a way you can't do on your own.
Okay, so I came out of a conversation before we came into this one, and I had a question prepared here for you, and it's pretty actually now realized just by listening to you that it's somewhat relevant to the conversation I was having. So I now have a very personal interest in hearing an answer to this. Because of course we have the professional coach, and then we have the leaders, and we're talking about the notion that leaders can adopt some of these skills and bring them into their leadership and management. And one of the areas that I'm a little bit interested in, based on the conversation I was having earlier with this other person, was this notion of sort of conflict, and how can coaches or leaders best handle things like resistance or hesitation? These are, or maybe some heated discussions and other uncomfortable conversations that they're having, or uncomfortable situations. What advice do you have for people who are experiencing those kinds of situations where it's not comfortable? It feels like conflict. Maybe some people are overreacting. Some people are passively, let's say, practicing some sort of passive aggression that people say, well, there's something going on, and they're just not revealing it. So what advice do you have from your experience of coaching and from writing, updating this book, that you could give any listeners out there who are interested in this?
Yeah. That actually comes down to the basics of emotional intelligence, that I'm a master of my emotions, not you. And so whatever you're experiencing, first off, I'm not going to make it negative. So if you get angry, frustrated, mad at me, or really sad, that's a human experience. You're now going through something where you're seeing different things that's causing you to react, which is actually good. So when my clients have a reaction to me, wherever on the range of emotions they are, I think it's a good thing. So I'm not going to like, oh, look what I did. It's like, oh, wow, look what I did. That's great. Because they're experiencing something new. They're seeing something new that caused that. So again, that whole noticing within myself as quickly as I can, any tenseness in my body, which is an emotional reaction. It happens in the body before the brain. That to catch that, release it, and come back to just choose two words: calm and curious, care and courageous. So two words that you come into as anchors any conversation, especially a difficult conversation. And anytime you think you're being knocked out of it, to come back to it, keep that space, keep that energy field, because it diffuses them. They'll go through the emotion, and then it'll decrease, and then you can get back to coaching.
So if you're the person who's experiencing a person on the other end who's become very emotional with you or with a situation, am I hearing that you're first of all, be curious about what might be going on for them, and also it's in a way, although we have this contagion or influence from states, how do I not get sucked into that toxicity perhaps that they're creating around me? What skills do coaches bring, or the coaching skills that about, the co-regulation, etc.? How do we bring that into play in situations where we're experiencing that?
Again, it comes back to how quickly can you recognize that you just had a reaction, and again, the emotions happen in the body. So you will have a point of tension somewhere. I can't tell you where you will have it because you experience fear, anxiety, anger in different places than me, maybe. When I ask people, where do you feel anger? I've had people say in their stomach, in their back. I had one woman say it's in my ears. So wherever you might get tightened up or warm, notice it. And the quickest way to relieve it is just breathe, exhale, breathe it out. And then you need to shift your emotional state. You can't just release the emotion. You have to come back to a neurological state. So instead of frustration, anger, fear, you need to come back to feeling something positive that triggers your own neurochemicals and hormones to be calm and curious and courageous and to think through it. When we feel emotions here, we're actually restricting blood flow to the brain. So when we back to, I really care about you in our mind. I'm here for you. This is fascinating what you're going through, and I believe that you're going to come through. I feel those things. Then I stay calm. My brain stays open. And again, my calmness is going to calm you down too. My first job was actually in a psychiatric hospital. And I remember one of the first things I learned, if somebody's having a psychotic reaction or whatever, don't try to constrain them. Just offer them a cup of water. Not a glass, not coffee, but a cup of water, because they would stop. It would stop the energy, and they go, huh. And all of a sudden, all that energy just started to dissipate. So that's essentially, we're thinking, okay, you need a cup of water, it's to maintain that calmness, which calms them down too, is so critical.
I hear echoes of the field of interoception and exteroception and all that there. And we don't have time to go there today. There's a lot of great research into, how we sense what's going on in our body and what messages and how the world around us is impacting what's going on in our body. And so we probably can't get to that today. I've got one or two questions left. How can teaching leaders coaching skills impact the culture of a company, and what steps can companies take to begin to integrate coaching conversations just into their day-to-day interactions?
Yeah. Well, I've helped a number of companies, and one of them just last year won an award for, during the pandemic, a retail company that used coaching skills to keep the company alive and active and successful, and their brand image good. And it was a Vietnamese company, so they had to deal with the whole hierarchy mindset, and the leader tells people what to do. So it's actually better than just teaching a few leaders how to use a coaching approach to to listen first, to understand, as Stephen Covey said, seek to understand before you are understood. To do that, and then to help the person think through their problem and come up with solutions together. But if you teach, even if you start with just a division, all the leaders know this, but you tell everybody, every employee knows what coaching is. So they know when they're being coached, it's okay. Like, okay, well, my leader is asking me questions now. They don't think it's odd, but they see the values and they have the chance to be coached. At this company, they had a platform where even people who clean the floors could go ask for a coach. They had coaching fairs where they showed the families, here's what coaching is, and so everybody knew what coaching was. And the leaders saw the power, or they knew that they were going to be, their people were going to ask them to be coached, that they started using the skills and giving people the chance to take risks, and they wouldn't be punished. And all of a sudden, the employees were handling customer issues so much better and on their own. They felt empowered to do that, and they could figure out problem solving better because their leader, using coaching skills, helped him to analyze situations differently than just telling them what to do. And so it's seeped through. So, it's got to start at the top. The top leaders have to promote coaching. Then leaders need training and coaching skills. But then the third thing, and hopefully there's internal coaches that are trained. And then the third thing is educate the entire company, even with a 5-minute video of what coaching is, so they know, and see the value. And it can change. It changes all the conversations, whether it's in teams, in the hallway, wherever they are together, changes the quality of the conversations. And now, there's decades now of research that show the great results that companies that do this, that they achieve.
Okay. So getting to the end, is there anything you would have liked me to ask you that I forgot to ask you?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, one thing though, we talk about coaching, but does it mean you always have to coach? And no, a leader wears many hats. I'm never telling them you need to be a coach and always coach. It's that coaching is another useful tool that you will use, but there will be some times that you've tried coaching and it's time to lay down the bottom line, and there must be directions given and consequences. That's just, there's that. Sometimes if you're giving the vision, you are giving the vision and then asking for their response. So I'm not saying you will coach with every conversation, but it's such a useful tool to have to help expand minds and create new possibilities.
Okay. So if there was one big idea or takeaway you'd like to leave my listeners with today, what would that be?
One of my favorite sayings is, they truly want you to be present more than they need you to be perfect.
I think that's profound. I think that will give people a lot of room for thinking. So how can people contact you, which I'll put links in the show notes for that benefit? I mean, websites, LinkedIn. Have you anything you'd like to offer my listeners?
Yeah, sure. Well, contacting me, my website is co-visioning, one word, like co-regulation, co-visioning.com. My books are all there, and there's lots of blog posts and tips and things that are useful. I'm certainly on LinkedIn and promoting the book. I'm active on all the different sites, but I think I mostly connect with LinkedIn. So you had mentioned about people contacting, direct messaging after this. What is your suggestion? Like the first 5 people, or I'll send you the first part of the book. I'll send you a download of the introduction that I said is all about the difference of coaching and AI.
Okay, so I guess let's say the first 3 people out there who can go right to Marcia, let's say on LinkedIn, and say, hey, I just heard you on Leading People podcast, and you said you'd send the first 3 people a download of part of the book so I can get a flavour of it. And let's see how that works out. So Marcia Reynolds, thanks for sharing your insights, tips and wisdom with me and my listeners here today.
Great, thank you for asking me.
Next on Leading People.
A person who is dealing with challenges in their life, they may be emotionally upset at times, they may have things that keep happening to them, that the book will help them think about their own patterns and how to disrupt those patterns for, more life-giving purposes. But they'll also realize that how they interact with people is affecting the people around them. If we think very basically, when you walk in the room, do other people cheer up or do they slowly start leaving? Because you're impacting, and who you are and who you have been to them in the past is impacting how they view you and the field that's being created. But now let's move to the leadership or coaching. Now we're dealing with not just the personal, we're dealing with patterns in the larger system.
Marcia Reynolds spoke in this episode about holding the space and the energy that helps insight emerge. Next time on Leading People, Alan Briskin and Mary Gelinas help us go further into that territory as we explore hidden fields, human connection, and what leaders need to notice in the spaces between people. You won't want to miss it.